In the last clip, we saw how we should be playing when our opponent is in time trouble. But what should we be doing when we're in time trouble? How should we confront this eternal problem that certainly seems to plague, I would say, a lot of players? I personally suffer from time to time. There are some serial time trouble addicts out there. Ones that come to mind, of course, Alexander Grishchuk, Peter Wells, the Grandmaster from England, who always seem to be in time trouble. So what's the best way you should be playing? How can you deal with this in a practical sense when you are inevitably in that situation? Now, of course, a lot of clever clogs out there will say, well, don't get into time trouble. That's the first step. And actually, that really is the key to this. Don't get into time trouble. If you don't get into time trouble, you won't be faced with making these tough decisions where you have to calculate and so on and so forth with very few seconds left on your clock. Now, the process or the way to stop getting yourself into time trouble is an entirely different matter. It's something you have to work on your own game, perhaps. Think about where you're spending the time, analyze your games and so on. But what this clip is going to deal with is actually what happens when we are in time trouble, because it is going to happen from time to time, and really how we should go about playing in that situation. And I've just chosen a couple of games, really, a couple of my own games. Again, this series is really only using my games. And here we reach a position after move 48, where I'm playing white against Grandmaster Marc Narciso Dublan in the 2013 Andorra Open. And we get to a position where Marc just played Queen E2, and clearly, material-wise, I'm doing very well. I've got an extra exchange, but I do have certain practical problems, that being that my back rank is weak, my king is a bit weak, he's got a decent bishop. That said, his king is also weak, his pawn is weak, and I've got a number of checks at my disposal. Now, clearly, with the 38-second increment, which is what we had here, I know that around this point I was down to maybe 3 minutes at most. So in this position after Queen E2, I had to calculate A, where I should be putting the rook, B, the consequences of, you know, if I let that D pawn go. For example, if I played Rook B1 here, you know, what happens in this kind of position? You know, am I winning? I had to assess end games without the queens and so on. So immediately after Queen E2, I remember eating up quite a bit of time, and suddenly I've got next to no time and I have to make a move. Now, my mistake was that, and this is a common theme actually, if you are in time trouble and you're playing with increment, give a few checks. That does not ruin the position, but that gives you a few more minutes to then think again. It's pretty logical. And I did it, but I did it incorrectly. I had to think first, to then leave myself with no time, to only then, when I've given a few checks, yeah, maybe I've got 2 minutes left again, but it's not enough. So here, when I first started, what I should have done is play Queen F8 check, King D7's the only move, come back to F7 check, King D6, and play Queen F8 again. Very simply, Queen F8. I should have repeated at least one more time, get an extra minute on the clock, and then when I've got maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 minutes to have a real think and calculate until the end. Unfortunately, what I did is I did all this in the wrong order. And then when he played E5, Queen F8 check, King E6, suddenly I'm thinking again, but I used a couple of minutes, and again, I just cannot find the win. It's a bit of a shame, because this would have put me, I think, on 3 out of 3. And I did actually have a win in this position. I, instead, having got into such bad time trouble, ended up giving a few checks and Queen E8 check, and actually this ended up as a draw. But if I had had more time, after Queen F check, King F, I would have been able to see Rook F1, Bishop takes D4, King H1. And here, the move I was worried about was this E4 move covering F6. And I thought, oh no, you know, I've got to calculate all of these lines, Queen F7. And if it all goes bad, suddenly I've got checkmate, back ranks, I've got these 2 pawns I've got to deal with. I just thought I've done this all wrong. So this would have actually won via the following sequence. But as you can see, it's a long sequence, and I had to see all of this if I was going to win the full point. So very badly done by me, and bailing out with a draw was definitely not good. So the moral of that story is, if you can repeat positions, do it. Don't be silly and forget that threefold repetition exists, like many have done, but try and repeat. Get a bit of time on your clock, and then compose yourself. Have a think, calculate the lines properly, and you'll be fine. Another game that I played in 2009 was against Grandmaster Ivan Sokolov, one of the top Grandmasters, certainly in the tournament we played, but in his peak in the world, scoring a famous victory over Kasparov, which didn't happen very often when Kasparov was at his peak, certainly to somebody who was perhaps a bit lower rated. And we get a position where Sokolov, after move 63, has just played knight takes f4, and I'm a bit short of time around this point. Now, the practical decision I made in this position was that, well, this weird ending should be a draw. But the last thing I need is for White to coordinate his 3 minor pieces and his king, win my h-pawn, and then play an awfully odd 2 knights versus and bishop versus rook position, which, who knows, if I can't exchange rook for bishop, may be drawn. What I knew about this ending, though, was that if I exchanged my rook for his bishop, even though I'm left with a pawn, and even though, for all of you endgame theoreticians out there, 2 knights and a king versus king and pawn is sometimes winning and sometimes not, depending on where the pawn is blockaded, because, and I'll show this in a minute, you know, I thought that gave me greater practical chances. So actually here, even though the best move might be king g7, might very clearly be the best move, I actually decided to chase this bishop with the rook. Rook a7, bishop c6, and I just chased it. Rook a6, bishop d5, rook a5. I was absolutely bent on winning that bishop, and I gave up the rook. Now, funny story is, this is actually mate in 83 moves. So the move I made was, objectively speaking, a complete disaster. But the practical difficulties of converting this position, I know very, very few people. I think I even spoke about this position with Vishy Anand, Mickey Adams. I know very few people, maybe none, now that I think of it, who can confidently say to me that they can convert this position. Because the idea is that you blockade the pawn, and blockading the pawn on the 5th rank, according to the textbooks, according to the database, the table basis, is winning. But winning this is a highly difficult task. And actually the fact that this is winning in 83 moves also means that actually perhaps I could claim a 50 move rule draw. What I did know is that you have to play perfectly. It's very easy for you to play as the defending side. So I felt like, instead of allowing White to gain momentum with the 2 pieces and the 2 knights and the bishop before, making him work in this ending was the correct practical choice. And I was in time trouble as well. So that was, you know, an added factor. The last thing I needed to do was calculate these weird positions where his knights are all active and his bishop's active. So I felt like the combination of those 2 things meant that I made the right choice. And I'm just flicking through the moves here, and I'm just showing you, I just moved my king away, and he never managed to... The idea of winning this endgame is to usher the king with 1 knight to a corner, trap the king in a corner, and then let the pawn go, bring in the other knight, let the pawn queen, and give mate. with the other knight. It's quite tricky. But I managed to stay away from the corners, and actually in the end, after over 100 moves, 110 moves in fact, Sokolov decided enough was enough and he just couldn't do it anymore. So, moral of the story from this chapter is then, if you're in time trouble, firstly, you know, it's difficult to be too critical, but if you can play in a way which allows you to gain more time, do it. If you can give checks if you can repeat the position, do it, and then reevaluate. If you're on the receiving end, if you're in time trouble and it's your opponent that's pressing you, what I would say is, again, look at the forcing lines first. Try and find ways that you feel require less calculation, but that, you know, clearly don't lose for you on the spot. Try and find the pragmatic way. If you're in time trouble, don't go down the complicated lines, because you're going to err. So that would be my big advice. And of course, again, something like the example we just saw here, if there is a way to bail out, if there is a bailout option, if there is an option which can allow you to reach time control or something like that, where you're going to be able to sit down and think, or at least pose serious practical problems for your opponent, do it. Don't hesitate. Don't try and play objectively, as I said, on move 63, king g7 in that position, because, you know, and keep the pieces on. What am I hoping for? I need to go into something that I know that I'm going to have real practical chances to hold, and you should be doing the same thing. So, you know, try and do all of those things. Naturally, as I said during this clip, if you can avoid time trouble as a whole, that's a huge bonus. That's an entirely different skill set. But I think if you're in time trouble, if you follow some of the advice that I mentioned in this clip, then you'll see a radical improvement in your results.